All right, continuing on. These social movements emerged as they did out of the aspiration of liberal democracies to recognize equally the dignity of all citizens. But democracies never live up to this pretension. People are often judged not on their individual character and abilities, whatever the law says, but on assumptions about them as members of groups. So here we have the subject of cultural diversity coming into the fore. Okay. In the United States, these prejudices were shamefully reflected for many years in formal laws that did not allow black children to be educated together with white ones, or that denied women the vote on grounds that they were insufficiently rational. But even when those laws were changed to desegregate schools and enfranchise women, the broader society did not suddenly cease thinking of itself in group terms. The psychological burdens of discrimination, prejudice, disrespect, or simple invisibility remained ingrained in social consciousness. They also remained because groups continued to differ from one another in their behavior, performance, wealth, traditions, and customs. Okay, so let's go back and look at Invisibility. Chapter 9 of Fukuyama is Invisible Man. What Fukuyama is referring to there is a book called The Invisible Man, if I can find the page here. Fukuyama says this: there is, of course, material deprivation in the United States in the lack of access to good education or health care, but the pain of poverty is felt more often as a loss of dignity. As Smith notes, the poor man's situation places him out of sight of mankind, such that they have no fellow feeling for him. This was the basic insight of Ralph Ellison's classic novel, Invisible Man, about a black man moving from the American South to Harlem. The real indignity of racism in the North was that African Americans were invisible to their white peers, not necessarily mistreated, but simply not seen as fellow human beings. And of course, not seen as fellow human beings, that's that sort of sense of this kind of sense of invisibility and indignity is precisely what those marchers in Memphis with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., they're carrying placards that said, "I am a man, I am a person," right? "I am a human being." Fukuyama has a whole chapter on this, and notice that he's talking about this sense of dignity and indignity, like when people are just ignored, and of course when they're disrespected and mistreated. There's people react indignantly and demand their dignity. So I just want to kind of point these things out from earlier in the book, so that you can understand what's going on in the chapter, and we don't have to go through the entire book. I think I can summarize these earlier points, and we can just focus on the end of the book here to get Fukuyama's argument. To the extent that there is an argument, sometimes he's not really making an argument, so that's a little problematic. And I think of him as a kind of insidious intellectual. He's promoting something that I don't agree with. I mean, that I strongly disagree with. Let's say that. But he does it in such a rhetorical and kind of vague way that it has a way of making people think that he's saying one thing when he's actually saying another. So just be careful of that. And I'm going to point out some things that I find problematic. And what is difficult about him is that literally what he says is is acceptable and good, but there's some insinuations and suggestions that he doesn't say explicitly, but he kind of suggests things that kind of, in my mind, go off the rails, and you might agree with me, or you might agree with Fukuyama. That's fine. Let's just be aware of the way in which he's kind of insidiously introducing some rather right-wing notions while claiming to be a classic liberal. You know, it's very hard to pin him down. So, I mean, it's difficult for me to articulate because he is so ambiguous and vague in his presentation. But here's one place where we get some rhetorical sort of suggestion of a very, what is typically understood as a right-wing notion, but he does it sort of very slyly, just quickly. On the side here, he says that the psychological burdens remain, the psychological burdens of racial segregation and discrimination and other forms of repression of minority groups. Those psychological burdens remain because groups continued to differ from one another in their behavior, performance, wealth, traditions, and customs. He's alluding here to the model immigrant sort of trope or mythology, that there's certain minority groups in the United States that are better as immigrants than others because they have better behavior, they have better performance, like in school, at universities, they make more money, they have more wealth, or they come with more wealth when they immigrate to the United States. Their traditions are more respectable, and customs. And of course, the sort of model of that right now in the United States in 2023 is Asian Americans. And, if we can get more specific, it used to be more like Japanese Americans, or even Vietnamese Americans. But now it's becoming Chinese Americans. And that's a particularly interesting example that shows the falsity of it, because 150 years ago, Chinese immigrants were severely discriminated against. There were laws made, the Exclusionary Act, to actually make sure that Chinese immigrants had difficulty becoming citizens. And of course, during World War II, the only, the most sort of reprehensible aspect of World War II, from the, sort of self-criticism about the United States, was the internment of Japanese Americans. The perception of this Asian Americans, especially embodied as Chinese and Japanese people, very specifically, it's flip-flopped. But without saying explicitly, Fukuyama suggests vaguely that the treatment of Chinese and Japanese and other Asian immigrants, Indians, all over the place, get this sort of treatment. Fukuyama suggests that there's some underlying real basis for that. even if it were, has it changed, in less than 100 years? Um, there's something very problematic about what he's suggesting, and what he's suggesting is rather right-wing, sort of, what some people might call racist. But of course, Fukuyama himself is an Asian American. Okay, so, but this is all what is significant here about this text to the philosophy of cultural diversity. As we begin to really analyze the way that people think about cultural diversity, we see that a lot of philosophical problems come up. And this is one of those. Okay. Continuing on, the new social movements that appeared in the 1960s arose in societies already primed to think in identity terms, and whose institutions had taken on the therapeutic mission of raising people's self-esteem. So this therapeutic mission is something that Fukuyama discusses in chapter 10. The democratization of dignity, okay? And notice that he keeps on using this word dignity. I'll have more to say about that a little later on. So here in chapter 10, Fukuyama says, Freudian psychoanalysis in the last decades of the 20th century went into a long-term decline in the United States, but the underlying therapeutic model continued to gain ground, and psychological language began to permeate the popular culture of developed societies. Again, notice how popular culture is very important here. Like the 1968 revolution, it was a cultural revolution, a popular cultural revolution. This idea of therapy and a therapeutic society is also part of that same cultural trend. For example, the term self-esteem was virtually absent from UK newspapers in 1980, but references to low self-esteem began to rise steadily to well over 3,300 by the year 2000. Psychological counseling expanded with a fourfold increase in the number of mental health professionals between 1970 and 1995. If therapy became a substitute for religion, which he fleshed out a little bit earlier in the chapter, religion itself took an increasingly therapeutic turn. This was true of both liberal and evangelical churches in the United States, whose leaders found that they could reverse the trend towards declining attendance if they offered what amounted to psychological counseling services built around self-esteem. Robert Schuller, a prominent televangelist whose Hour of Power show was broadcast weekly to millions of viewers over several decades, and whose Crystal Cathedral in Garden Grove, California, was one of the largest churches in the United States. He wrote a book early on entitled Self-Esteem, the New Reformation. Like in the Protestant Reformation, this is the New Reformation. It's all about self-esteem. Rick Warren, whose church growth movement has transformed many thousands of evangelical churches in recent decades, has put forth a similar therapeutic message. His trademark purpose-driven life movement emphasizes the importance of pastors attending to the felt needs of non-believers, de-emphasizing traditional Christian doctrine in favor of an overtly psychological language. Like Schuller and like the California Task Force, which you mentioned earlier, Warren downplays sin in any judgmental aspect of traditional religion. The gospel is more of an owner's manual, quote unquote, for how to achieve happiness in this life rather than in the one beyond. Luther, that is Martin Luther's Christian dignity, was something hard to achieve. The purpose-driven life, by contrast, is available to everyone. Fukuyama's mention of Luther here is very important because Fukuyama sees Martin Luther as one of the key founders of the notion of one's inner worth, inner dignity, and this inner man, which I think I have mapped out to look at that a little closer a bit later. So Luther's Christian dignity was something hard to achieve. The purpose-driven life of Rick Warren, by contrast, is available to everyone. The therapeutic turn, so this phrase, therapeutic turn, is what Fukuyama is referring to in chapter 11. In the popular culture of advanced liberal democracies such as the United States was inevitably reflected in its politics and in an evolving understanding of the role of the state, of the government. In the classical liberalism of the 19th century, the state was held responsible for protecting basic rights, such as freedom of speech and association, for upholding a rule of law, and for providing essential public services such as police, roads, and education. The government recognized its citizens by granting them individual rights. It's a big thing in Fukuyama, is that liberalism that he espouses is about individual rights and very focused on individualism. But the state was not seen as responsible for making each individual feel better about him or herself. Under the therapeutic model, however, an individual's happiness depends on his or her self-esteem, and self-esteem is a byproduct of public recognition. So public recognition, dignity, these are Fukuyama conflates these two things, that dignity is about public recognition. I'll have more to say about that. Governments are readily able to give away public recognition in the way that they talk about and treat their citizens. So modern liberal societies naturally and perhaps inevitably began to take on the responsibility for raising the self-esteem of each and every one of their citizens. Okay. So this is the therapeutic turn that Fukuyama is talking about. It's a cultural phenomenon, and he wants to say that it's about public recognition. And he says that governments it's easy for them to give out public recognition, so this just becomes part and parcel of liberal democracy in the 20th century. Again, ambiguously, Fukuyama does not say that this is necessarily bad, but his tone suggests that he finds something really wrong with it. And we'll see, how that tone fits into what he has to say later in chapter 11.